Okay. All right. I think we're going to start. People may dribble in with food. Hopefully not dribbling the food, but dribbling in. Um, anyway, good afternoon. It's really a pleasure to have you here today, especially with the nicer temperatures and maybe a little touch of spring in the air. My name is Malcolm Russell Einhorn. I'm a research professor of international affairs here at the Elliott School. And I want to welcome you today to a really interesting talk on uh, investing in local climate action, the evolving role of national governments. Um, I think this is really a truly timely topic, worthy of much more attention than it's received, I think, to date. But it's also, I think, a topic that may require some tactical rethinking in light of everything that's going on in the world. And I probably expect that we'll uh, be hearing more about that as today's conversation unfolds. Um, Before I introduce our speaker, I just wanted to say, and our discussants, I should say, I want to note that the event today is really going to have to get bad posture here. Anyway, I should note that this event today is part of a speaker series here at the Elliott School on sustainable subnational governance. This is under what's called the Elliott School Sustainable Local Governance Lab. This is lightly funded, so I don't want to overstate its footprint. It's evolving, but the lab is an interdisciplinary initiative involving a dozen faculty and is focused on better understanding policy challenges related to climate change planning and action at both the state and local level. And it's global, obviously, being the International Affairs School. I should also mention another cross-disciplinary initiative here at the Elliott School. It's somewhat broader. It's a university-wide activity on cities, climate change, and data innovation, which, among other things, is aimed at creating a global network that over time can, in turn, help generate an urban climate index. This would be synthesizing very diverse kinds of data on climate change risks and economic development in large and medium-sized cities all over the world. And finally, of course, I should mention that all of this is subsumed under and there are many other things going on at the university, which I won't belabor, including a subnational diplomacy executive training course. We have some people here who are at the head of that. But this is all subsumed under the Sustainability Alliance here at GW, which, as you may know, is generally tasked with coordinating and helping coordinating activity, but also coordinating and vetting the curricula, the course curriculum on campus concerned with climate issues. I should also mention, actually, in passing, that there also is a longstanding project on adaptation in Arctic cities, led by Professor Bob Ortung. That's principally housed in the geography department, but that's something also going on in this global urban sustainability space. So now for the topic at hand, and it really does loom large as a multi-level governance challenge. We'll hear from Kate Johnson, our speaker, but I think this is also a topic that offers significant opportunities, unexplored opportunities, which is why this topic is so timely at this point. So in this context, let me say it's not an exaggeration to say that a few people are sort of better positioned to talk about this topic than Kate Johnson. She is Regional North America Director at the C40 Cities Organization. You may have seen in the flyer that she formerly, as of a few weeks ago, was the U.S. Federal Affairs Director. She's been promoted to undertake also working with Canadian cities as part of her remit. So in this role, she works with C40 member cities and partners to advance federal policies that can support cities in achieving their climate goals, but also help national governments and their partners better understand and document the subnational actions that advance national commitments on climate change. And meanwhile, I will say Kate also, of course, brings ground level urban perspectives on these issues because she previously served as for 8 years as the Washington, D.C. Department of Energy and Environment Director of an interdisciplinary team that was charged with advancing DC's carbon neutrality and carbon neutrality and climate resistance goals. Earlier in her career, Kate worked for the American Council for Energy Efficient Economy, where she launched a program focused on affordable housing and helped to establish a city energy efficiency scorecard. And now finally, we're turning it over to Kate. I'll introduce our two discussants. We're fortunate to have them here today. Chaz Cadwell in the middle is our Institute Fellow at the Urban Institute here in Washington, D.C., where he previously served as Vice President for International Development and Growth, overseeing projects involving international development, democratization, and governance reform. Before that, he served 16 years as director of the IRIS Center at the University of Maryland, where he undertook similar development work in many diverse countries, 24, I think. He's currently involved in local government projects in Moldova and Kenya, both of which feature challenging issues of institutional capacity building, service delivery effectiveness, and multi-level policy coordination. Matt Eldridge, to his left, is a senior program officer in the Development Policy and Finance team at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, where he concentrates on issues of climate change, finance, and policy, particularly the potential macroeconomic impact of climate change on developing countries. Prior to joining the foundation, Matt worked at the Urban Institute, focusing on research and technical assistance around results-based financing approaches. He has also consulted on U.S. banking and asset management regulation and held roles at the World Bank, where he concentrated on issues of aid effectiveness. So now finally, I will turn the floor over to Kate and look forward to your remarks.
Thank you so much. Hi. Let me start my timer. I have a feeling there might be quite a lot of questions and discussions given the topic. Thank you so much for that introduction, and thanks so much for inviting me to be here at GW today. As Malcolm said, my name is Kate Johnson. I have been with C40 Cities for the past 3 years, but before that, got to spend 8 years working for the DC government. And during that time, I've had the opportunity to partner with lots of different programs and institutions here at GW. And so it's really great to be able to be here today. I don't think I've ever had a chance to appreciate the view here. So it's really great. I think this topic couldn't be more near and dear to me, as I think I've been tackling different elements of this question of the connection between national and local climate action really throughout my career. I came to Washington, D.C. straight out of college and worked for a number of different advocacy organizations pushing for national level climate legislation. That didn't go so well the first time around. And so found myself really intentionally looking to work at the local level because I saw cities and towns across the US were being really innovative and inspiring. That was a long time ago, and I think that's really continued. And so I spent the last 3 years since coming to C40, really focused on helping US cities take advantage of this great opportunity we had in the United States to through the funding from the the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure law. A lot has changed even since Malcolm invited me to give this talk in terms of what is the US's role at the national level and how is that affecting things globally. So I'll admit what I'm going to share today is a little bit of work in progress and my own thoughts and how this conversation is evolving. And so I really do look forward to the discussion. Okay, so I'm going to start with just a little bit of background about C40 for those of you who don't know us. And then I'm going to do a little bit of global context sharing before diving in a little bit to the United States, which is obviously very much in flux at the moment. And then zoom back out to talk about the role of local, national partnerships globally and some of the work that we are doing in the lead up to COP30 in Brazil. And then touch finally on the need for urban climate finance is one key area where we would love to see more national and local cooperation. So starting with C40. So at the heart, we are a network of mayors. So we're in nearly 100 cities around the globe. And we are a network of the largest and most ambitious cities when it comes to climate action. And when you take the sum total of the cities in our network, we are representing almost 600 million urban residents across the world. And those cities influence, nearly $1 trillion, a trillion people kind of within their wider urban regions. And if you can read the teeny tiny print at the bottom, you can see a list of all of the cities. But if you have a question about a specific city, please let me know. We are led by our mayors. So the C40 has two co-chairs, one from a global North city and one from a global South city. Our current co-chairs are the mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, and the mayor of Freetown, Sierra Leone, Yvonne Aki-Sawyer. And so they work together to oversee our steering committee, which includes vice chairs from around the world, and really shape the direction of C40 and what our focus is in any given year. Hopefully I don't have to make the case too much for this room on why cities, but the numbers are really quite staggering. So while cities occupy just 2% of the world's landmass, they represent the lion's share of energy use, greenhouse gas emissions, and economic activity. So really, we can't tackle the climate crisis without focusing on cities. Okay, so that's about C40. Now, let's talk about the moment that we are living through right now. I will try to not make this too depressing, but I think I do want to start with the very sobering, context in which we are trying to advance local climate action. So last year, no surprise, 2024 was the hottest year on record. And for the first time, the world breached the 1.5 degree warming target that was established by the Paris Climate Agreement 10 years ago this year. So the state of climate breakdown is that it is happening now. And so the level of urgency, that we feel as a network and that our cities feel is quite high. At the same time, the pace and scale of climate disasters is accelerating around the world. So here in the United States, we all just saw the devastating wildfires in Los Angeles, Hurricane Helene devastating Western North Carolina, but those disasters are really playing out around the world. So this photo is from the flooding in Rio Grande do Sul in Brazil, but I have colleagues that are dealing with, landslides and floods really at any given moment around the world. You can probably find a community that's dealing with some sort of climate related disaster. And that's all playing out in a moment where we're seeing this rightward shift politically, really in countries around the world. So I can speak most in depth about what we see happening here in the United States. This map shows just how broadly the voters shifted to the right between 2020 and 2024. But really in elections throughout the last year, we've seen this rightward shift. So in Argentina, in Italy, in India, I had a question mark around Germany because I did these slides before the election yesterday, and I think I can take the question mark out at this point. So this is creating real challenges for how we think about national leadership when it comes to climate action and what that means for cities. And then we also, there's a lot of questions about the future of multilateralism. So we know as a network that global cooperation is absolutely essential to stopping the climate crisis. But at the same time, multilateral institutions are under attack for not delivering. So whether that's the UNFCCC or the World Health Organization, I think there's a very real questioning of the role of these institutions happening. Um, and we're hopeful that COP30 in Brazil is an opportunity to reset. And one way to do that is to actually highlight the importance of multi-level partnerships between the local, national, and global level. And this is a photo maybe from a happier time of the local climate action summit that took place in Dubai at COP28. Okay, so if that wasn't sobering enough, let's talk about what is happening in the United States. This is a photo of one of the many executive orders that the Trump administration has signed in actually it's just been a month, rolling back energy and clean energy and climate funding here in the United States. Oh, looks like my sentence got cut off there, but maybe that's actually, it's telling because they're not done yet. So this list is going to grow. But this is just a partial summary of some of the executive actions that we've seen the Trump administration take since, January 20th, starting with the withdrawal from the Paris Climate Agreement, all the pause on IRA and IIJA funding, repeal of environmental justice protections, and then rollback of, I guess this works, fill in the blank. So we're anticipating rolling back of emission standards for vehicles and power plants, among other things. And the impact that is having on cities and mayors, it's mixed, I would say. So there's definitely a lot of uncertainty, but it's also sparking resolve among mayors who are committed to taking action, but recognizing that they may need to do so with an eye towards political consequences or even retribution. So right here, I have a quote from Mayor Johnson of Chicago, who has been outspoken in his commitment to climate action, to his sanctuary city status. And as a result, the city is being sued by the Trump administration and threats of withholding federal funding from the city and the state. So I think the risks are very real, and that's something that we're very mindful of in thinking about how to work with and support our cities in this moment. But at the same time, we're seeing that clean energy is still booming. I think the first quarter showing a slight slowdown in the investments in clean energy. But the reality is a lot of the private sector investment that was sparked by the Inflation Reduction Act is going to continue. And a lot of it is happening in Republican congressional districts, which will be very interesting to see how that plays out. And if, as things are debated in Congress, if party matters less than whether or not dollars in investment are flowing to congressional districts around the country. We've already seen a number of Republican members of Congress stand up in defense of particular elements of the Inflation Reduction Act that are benefiting, their communities. So that is to be determined and playing out in real time. So I was hoping when I first came to talk that I was going to be able to share how, the US and this national investment very intentionally in local climate action was serving as an example for the rest of the world. That might not be the case. And I think right now the global climate movement is really looking to who are the other leaders who are stepping up in this space and really building these multi-level partnerships. And C40, along with a number of organizations, is part of an initiative called CHAMP, the Coalition for High Ambition Multi-Level Partnerships, which is a mouthful, which is why we came up with CHAMP. But this was a coalition that was formed by the COP28 presidency that now includes 74 national governments. I think the US is still technically a part of that because they signed on under the Biden administration. Um, but then we've added Tunisia as a last week, so maybe 74 is still the right number. Um, and the goal of this initiative was really to get strong subnational involvement in the creation of new nationally determined commitments so that countries can be more ambitious if they are thinking holistically about what their local and state equivalent action can contribute at the national level. And so we've been working in countries across the world on this initiative that represent a third of global population and more than half of global GDP and about a third of global emissions. Obviously, if the US withdraws from that, these numbers will change a bit. But when the US did deliver its NDC at the end of last year, it did, by necessity, include quite a bit of state and local action in order to get to their new target. So, our hope for 2025 is that we'll continue to see national governments incorporate strong subnational actions and raise their commitment as a result. And that also, this commitment to one thing to put it in your NDC, it's another thing to actually commit to helping see that local action, whether that's through finance or capacity building. And so that's sort of the next step in this program. And I think there's been a history of successful engagement of subnationals in the COP process, but it is still not central. It started as early as the Earth Summit in 1992, and then really hit a high point in 2023 at COP 28, where CHAMP was formed, and there was this commitment to accelerate delivery of multi-level action. And then looking ahead to COP30 in Brazil, we are really encouraged by what we are hearing from the president of COP30 and the executive director of COP30 that have made a real clear commitment and are working with us in Brazil to engage subnational leaders in their own commitment and in the COP process. So we are looking forward to the opportunities this is going to provide later this year in Brazil. All right. I wanted to dive into one particular issue that I thought might help spur some of the discussion among the group, which is around urban climate finance. And I think this is an area where, whether we're here in the United States or talking about cities in the global South, where national governments can be either a hindrance or a real catalyst in driving finance and investment into cities for their climate priorities. So, recognizing this, last year, actually almost exactly a year ago, we and our partners sent a letter to the multilateral development banks from 40 mayors and governors from around the world to draw attention to the challenges that cities face in accessing climate finance. And that's for a lot of different reasons. And while these are primarily from a development context, I think actually the same applies when we think about small and mid-sized cities here in the United States. Poor credit worthiness, limited fiscal decentralization, where some cities, especially in the global South, don't actually have much control over their budgets, which is something folks here in DC might relate to. And there's a lot of revenue uncertainty, and they don't have direct access to capital markets in the same way that big cities here in the United States do. There is often political misalignment between the different government levels, where you have a mayor from an opposition party. And in the case of several of our mayors, that can lead to being put on trial or thrown in jail if you do something that is out of step with the party that is in power at the national level. There's also just a lack of capacity in a lot of cities to put together big, complex projects that are appealing to financial institutions. And also, those projects tend to be smaller in size than what national governments might be putting forward. So it's hard to articulate the value of a portfolio, maybe of smaller urban infrastructure projects. And so one initiative that C40 has that's trying to address this problem is the C40 finance facility. And so this is funded in partnership with the German government, as well as another number of other national government partners. Um, then it's really trying to tackle this problem where we estimate $4 trillion per year in infrastructure investment that is needed in developing countries, in cities. Um, we have identified almost 400 cities that are actively seeking finance for urban climate projects. But only a tiny fraction um, of the capital that's managed, whether it's by pension funds or sovereign wealth funds or other institutional investors, is going towards these types of infrastructure projects. And so we work with cities to develop their projects to provide that capacity that we know is needed, and also to connect them directly to finance opportunities, especially in cases where the finance isn't able to flow from the national level to the city level for structural or political reasons. And so one example I wanted to share, the project we're really excited about, which is the Freetown cable car, that is being championed by our co-chair Mayor Aki Sawyer. They are looking to develop their first cable car project, which would serve a number of their informal settlements in the hills on the outskirts of the city. It would transform public transit in Freetown, which does not have a robust public transit system right now, and allow these underserved communities access to the central business district, creating employment opportunities in a way that's much less expensive to build than a traditional, rail transit project. As you can imagine, this is an innovative, non-typical infrastructure project, and so actually helping the city navigate, the various finance opportunities. They wouldn't have been able to do it without the support of a program like the C40 Cities Finance Facility. And so our ask of the big institutional investors is that they create more capacity building programs like this. So that is just one of many examples. I wanted to end on a high note because I figured the first 2/3 of what I had to share was maybe a little bit more depressing. So hopefully that will spark some discussion. I'm happy to take questions. And yeah, just thank you for having me. So back over to you. Welcome.
So we're going to have two discussants whom I've already introduced. Matt will go first. And I think we're interested in not only looking at some of these friction points that transcend the current political situation. They could be organizational, they could be financial, they could be knowledge-based. But I'm hoping our two discussants can surface those, and we'll start with Matt.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Malcolm. Thank you for hosting and organizing this, and thank you to the Elliott School, and thank you for everyone for being here. Appreciate the opportunity to speak. I think similar to Kate's presentation, I'll try to end on a high note with some positivity. I think I've structured it unintentionally as like exactly working up. I have three sort of gaps in areas where national, subnational cooperation and partnership is essential to drive climate action. Then four challenges, barriers to doing so and cooperation, then five areas where things are getting better. So 3, 4, 5, though it was unintentional. Just in terms of context, so you sort of know where I'm coming from in this, the Gates Foundation, our climate work is entirely focused on adaptation and resilience. And entirely focused in developing countries, so sub-Saharan Africa in particular and South Asia, with a little bit of work in Southeast Asia. And most of the work that we do is actually in rural areas rather than municipalities. So looking at subnational arrangements and capacities for finance and operations and programmatic work in rural areas in particular. So that being said, sort of three gaps. The first may not be surprising is data. A lot of the data on climate risks is held at the national level or is held either at the national level or subnational level, but is not granular enough to be useful for subnational decision making. That's a major challenge. When you're looking at something, for example, like agriculture, and agriculture in Africa is 95% rainwater fed, so it is extremely climate vulnerable. but that rainwater fall differs quite a bit place by place, and also the soil quality and the type of crops that are grown region by region differs quite a bit. So having access to some of that data at the very hyper-local level is super useful to actually make decisions about what to invest in. So even if you have that data at the local level, it's not always clear how to prioritize the investments based on that. So prioritization is sort of the second area where cooperation is super important and useful to understand, if my region has significant water risks, do I spend the limited money I have available to build a seawall over here, or should I elevate homes over here? You can't really do all of it in most contexts, even in developed countries. So that level of prioritization is really important to have the central government, the national government, sort of weigh in to help you understand sort of what they're seeing in terms of their economic modeling. And the third area, another probably not surprising, is finance. So having the cooperation, the partnership of the national government in harnessing the different sources of financing and understand how to match those sources of financing with the types of investments. Some investments that are better suited for grants, some investments that are better suited for concessional, some investments that are better suited for pure private or mostly private investments. Really requires the national government to have an important role in sort of helping to steer some of those conversations, either directly or through national development banks, which I'll circle back to. So those are three gaps: data, prioritization, and finance. The challenges that exist, first is related to political economy, institutions, and governance. I know Chaz will talk a lot about that, so I won't say too much. But I will say, in a lot of cases, some national governments have very weak existing public financial management systems, where if you put new resources through those systems, it's going to lead to bad results. It's not going to change the results unless you reform and strengthen the political economy, or sorry, the public financial management that exists currently. Second is just not enough money. So I mentioned that before on prioritization. There's not nearly enough money. There's a lot of estimates about the adaptation finance gap. I think it's UNEP estimated at over $200 billion a year. It's rising fast. Whatever the exact number is, it's a lot. It's billions of dollars, and we just don't have enough financing. So at the end of the day, there are going to have to be hard decisions that are made that affect people's lives and livelihoods. Third challenge is there's a lot of uncertainty about climate. So unlike some other challenges, climate has a lot of different scenarios, right? We see the temperatures rising, as Kate was showing on the chart. We've passed 1.5, but where are we going from there? There's a lot of uncertainty about what exactly will happen and how climate will respond and how disasters will respond to that. There's the added complexity of tipping points within climate, where you reach a certain point and everything else is out the window. Everything can change your calculations. So do you safeguard or plan ahead for a risk that should only happen once every 100 years, but may happen once every 10 years? Or do you plan ahead for a risk that's once every 500 years? What are the risk levels that you're willing to tolerate? Climate is also a very systemic risk, where it impacts so many different areas in different ways that are hard to disentangle. Food security is a really big one, right? Food security, climate impacts food security, which impacts inflation, which impacts migration and health, nutrition, all sorts of other things. So it's extremely, extremely difficult challenge to wrap your head around. And the final challenge, I'd say, is motivation to act. It's really hard to get jurisdictions and governments to act to avoid losses. A future loss that may or may not actually occur, it's really hard to get people to be motivated by that. It's a lot easier politically, usually, to do disaster recovery, even though that's so much more expensive and has so much more damaging effects. So trying to change the motivation, the incentives that exist to actually act in advance is quite challenging. So those are the challenges. Now here's the good news, I guess, things that are maybe getting better or going in the right direction. I'd say the first thing is on innovation. We have a lot more evidence now than we did even 5-10 years ago about what are the most innovative, high impact adaptation and resilience investments. Just highlighting one, we do a lot of support to CGIAR, Consultative Group for Innovative Agriculture Research, I think it is. And they, thank you. And they do incredible research into drought resistant and stress resistant crop varieties, into feed for livestock that'll help them withstand some of the additional stresses, new irrigation technologies that, again, responding to some of the stresses and the shocks that occur. So the innovations that they have exist. They just need to be scaled. So that's good, right? I mean, scaling is its own challenge, but at least we have a lot of these innovations in place that can lead to really significant impacts. The second area, which I'd say is getting better, is data access. Early warning systems is something that we've invested quite a bit in. There's this initiative called Aim for Scale that the Gates Foundation and the UAE launched at COP28 a couple years ago. The first investment that is going to make is around early warning systems around monsoons in India. If you're able to understand what the risks are far enough in advance, farmers can take the prerequisite actions and local governments can make sure the right resources are available for those communities before the disasters hit. So it's measurable impact in terms of the ability to bounce back from some of these storms and disasters. Also, more generally, there's a lot more data that's getting available at the subnational level. Just as one example, as you know, COP30 is this year, as Kate was saying, so a lot of eyes are on Brazil, including some of the examples that Brazil can provide, both in terms of some of the risks and impacts, as well as some of the work they've been doing to try to address those impacts. So there's a platform called Adaptive Brazil, which allows local municipalities and all subnational governments to go on, see what risks are very specific to their area, and then they can take the requisite actions. There's also resources called Adaptation Atlas, for instance, which enables governments to look at the risks very specific to the crops that are grown in individual subregions in their countries. So there's a lot more access to data, which is definitely a big plus. Using that data is, of course, another hurdle. Third area is the role of national development banks. So MDBs were evoked. MDBs provide over half of the international public financing by far, I think, well more than a half. I don't remember the exact numbers, but quite a bit of it. So they are key to addressing the financing challenges around adaptation and resilience, but they don't do a great job of working at the subnational level. So they partner quite a lot with governments, but there are also other institutions, particularly national development banks, that play a very important role in co-financing with these international players like the MDBs, like the green climate funds and other vertical climate funds. So institutions like BNDES, which is the National Development Bank of Brazil, or the Development Bank of South Africa, they're able to take financing from the multilaterals and other sources, bring it together, offset some of the credit risk, the foreign exchange risk, and so that the financing is provided very on demand to local borrowers in ways that are cost effective, so lower cost of capital. So the national development banks have a very significant role to play. Right this week in Cape Town is Financing Commons Summit, which is the summit of all public development banks, and this is one of the topics I know that they're discussing currently. Fourth area, because I feel like I'm running over, is Ministry of Finance use to prioritization. And this is a bit of a self-serving one because I work quite a lot on this. But the Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Action, which is an entity that has, I think, 80 or 90 countries around the world that are members of, is working to improve the integration of climate data into economic analysis and economic modeling, so that those various different scenarios that I was talking about before can be used to inform how the ministries of finance at the national level think about priorities for public investments and public policies. Translating that again to the subnational level is the next step, but that's something that happens already anyway in countries. They have to go through that negotiated process. Now at the national level, there'll be a better sense of where those risks are highest with what sectors and what geographies. And the final thing I'll mention is around private finance. So with adaptation and resilience in particular, the majority of financing is going to have to be public. There's no getting around that. But there's a very significant role to play for private finance. If you are a household and you're elevating your house, I mean, that's private investment right there in future-proofing the property that you have. If you're a company, you're thinking about the supply chain, how exposed is it? How can you lessen that exposure? If you're supporting development of private infrastructure, again, you're going to want to make sure it's built to resilient standards. Even though it's small, it is growing. There's about $5 billion a year CPI estimated last year in private adaptation finance. And there's a few specific areas where this is growing fastest. So there are new business models within agriculture, private adaptation finance for agriculture, including things like green fertilizer, which have very significant application, which support adaptation and support mitigation goals. There's a lot of interest by institutional investors in adaptation and resilience. Within the US, I think a lot has been made of asset managers and institutional investors pulling back from climate. BlackRock and others have maybe walk back a little bit, but they're still investing in these areas, particularly in adaptation and resilience, and particularly in Europe, where they have a broader definition of fiduciary risk and sort of what is the long-term investment risk that their portfolio is exposed to and the type of investments they may want to make. So institutional investors, which represent trillions of dollars, are increasingly looking at adaptation and resilience investments as key to the long-term health of their portfolios. And last two things, one are insurers. And insurance products have a really important role to play in helping to manage some of these risks. Now, there's an extent to which they can go, and there's certain risks that are uninsurable. If you know a risk is going to happen or is very likely to happen, it's going to be very expensive. But there are other risks that can be insured against, and the combination of insurance products with other non-insurance products can be quite useful. And insurers fully understand that climate change is real. You'll never meet an insurer who doesn't believe in climate change. They're exposed to it every single day, and they see the changes over time. Very last thing is domestic private sector. In a lot of the countries in which we operate, domestic private sector is relatively small, but you're not going to address resilience long term without activating and deepening that domestic capital market. Those domestic investors in places like Kenya, Nigeria, Ghana, they're the most exposed to these risks, and they have the highest motivation to invest to address those risks versus international private finance, which can just relocate. It's not quite as simple as that, but they are more inclined to relocate if the costs don't make sense. And with that, I think that's everything I want to say.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And very helpful summary of the issues. A nice set of lists for us to use in the future in our own thinking about these issues. As
Thank you, Malcolm, and thank you, Kate, for your talk, and all of you for coming. It's hard to be optimistic about a $4 trillion a year problem we're going to fix in 90 minutes. But
Yeah, you kind of had to hunch over it.
okay, I'm pretty good at hunching at my age. But I wanted to supplement what Kate's excellent presentation with a couple of things that I think begin to explain a little bit why this is a particular challenge. And one is cities are subnational and you're a mayor of a particular place. And so for you to invest in climate mitigation activities is great because you're helping save the planet. But the rewards for that investment accrue to the whole planet, not to you and your constituents. So it may be very difficult to undertake. And we saw the fight that they had to introduce congestion pricing in New York and at this point maintain it. But every city, if you invest in, I remember hearing a presentation by a mayor from Mozambique who was talking about investing in mitigation steps or adaptation. And he made the excellent summary comment that mangroves don't vote, meaning we can save the mangroves who play an important role in mitigating climate change, but nobody's voting for me to save the mangroves. They're voting to make the sewers work, the roads be smooth, get housing for others. So for a mayor, adaptation investments are almost like a private good. You invest in fixing the sewers, your voters get better service, they reward you politically. If you don't do it, they penalize you politically. So that I tried to frame my talk, Kate, to have questions for you at the end of each bit. But the question here is, your C40 cities are doing some amazing things. A lot of them, to my surprise, are mitigation focused. And I'm interested how your mayors wrestled with this basic political economy of generating a global public good, and perhaps not at the cost of local private goods that help them electorally or economically in their neighborhood. The other point I'd like to make, I guess, I'm not a climate expert, but I've worked on local government issues around the globe for quite a while. So and I ought to recommend, by the way, if people haven't looked at it yet, the roadmap for global South cities that C40 has done. It's a detailed version of Kate's talk, but it's excellent on a whole range of these issues, and it's lots of pictures, so it's easy for some of us to read.
Right for mayors, they like pictures too.
Presidents too.
Yeah.
And I also want to recommend there's a Latin America coalition of city finance officers, CFOs. And I also really appreciate 'cause it's getting to people who are actually responsible for doing stuff. And they formed a year ago, I guess, maybe 2 years ago. I don't remember.
Year and a half.
But in any event, there's some excellent inventorying of what's happening in Latin America, where there's more fiscal independence perhaps than other parts of the world as well. But all of these reports, all the good activities are, I think, Kate, you called them largest and most ambitious cities in C40. They are the exception. And the rule that cities live with mostly are very different. And so what gets summarized at the tail end of lots of these reports is about the weak enabling environment. That weak enabling environment existed before climate was our challenge we were facing. And so the huge existing infrastructure gap that is responsible for some of the vulnerability to climate change at the current time, cities built at too low an elevation without infrastructure, whether it's nature-based solutions or just regular things that we come to expect in rich country cities. Our enabling environment's a big, broad term. It covers a whole lot of things that have to work well. And because it's a lot of different components, they're difficult to fix. If there's an election and the mayor changes, the rules that you did your deal with the same the next month. Well, we know that from our own experience here, that's not the case. Are you going to be able to charge rates if you're doing something that's a utility of sorts that are going to be stable? Commission structure is the same. Can you get assured access to the land you need? And who controls that? Is it the city? Is it the central government? Is it some combination of other oligarchs who have influence over some level of government? How do you get disputes resolved? Who sorts things out when the city and the central government don't agree? These are all existing institutional gaps that affect existing infrastructure, and they also put a tax on whatever ambitions we have in the climate area, both leaving aside the mitigation stuff, but even on the infrastructure and adaptation aspects. So this issue of multi-level governance is important, and you note it, Kate, and everybody does. The problem is countries are organized differently all around the globe. They may look the same. We have mayors, governors, we have presidents, ministries of finance, we've got regional bodies, but they all have incredibly different institutional arrangements. How are they chosen politically and sustained politically? Who's got administrative control over decisions about where, when, how much, accountable to who? And importantly, then fiscally, who controls the money? A group I'm involved with called the Local Public Sector Alliance, which has a website, decentralization.net, which is crowded with reports on this, some of it related to climate, but all of it related to multi-level governance and why, you'd think with the needs so clear and so great in so many global south cities, money would flow, but it doesn't. And it doesn't largely because of these governance constraints. And they're difficult to solve because each of them didn't spring out of the ground undesigned. They all benefit somebody. No central government minister wants to give up power. And yet, all the decentralization efforts to localize things, put services closer to the people who are benefiting from all that means that central bodies have to give up share power. So I'm working on was working until it got suspended, cancel in project in Moldova, where the central government, the regional governments, and the local governments have the very same powers in several statutes. So who's actually responsible for things? Well, it's the Ministry of Finance who has the money, that's who. But you've got ministries who don't have incentives to cooperate, and you've got levels of government that haven't really sorted out who's in charge. And those are in places work, right? The streetlights are on, roads get paved, but at a much more delayed and costly and less responsive level than is necessary. So that the climate complement to that is just a huge burden that we can't expect cities to do on their own. You know, Kenya's got macroeconomic challenges, for example. They're huge. The country's broke. They have to negotiate with the IMF. It's going to require all sorts of reforms they can't implement. They've got 47 new local governments that they created in 2010 constitutional change, who have very unclear autonomy, are trying to raise enough revenue just to provide healthcare, which is a new service they're responsible for. And yet, the national government's fiscal problems mean that the annual allocation to localities is going to shrink. They'll be under great pressure. And so to expect mayors to somehow step up and raise money from who? I think it's, you know, ideally we'd have Kenyan private sector, but also those of us with money from outside Kenya willing to invest in helping solve Kenya's problems. But for the same reason we haven't done so already, they're going to confront those as we think about helping solve the climate crisis. So part of me says there must be some subset of many countries where this crisis is an opportunity to pay attention to issues that have been there all along, but now exacerbated by climate crisis. And so a question I have for you is whether any of your mayors, successful as they are, they're amazing people doing amazing things with your support and others, are they able to or ambitious to or taking steps to integrate the solutions they've found into the institutional framework so that when that mayor's gone, when your C40's moved on to something else, that the allocation of decision-making and money decision-making has changed. So it's not a project, it had some systemic change. And then I guess the preliminary note I have is with the US withdrawing from Paris and perhaps others, and the permission structure that provides for other people to pare back. I'm not the climate expert, but I assume that exacerbates or it makes it even more difficult reaching whatever target we have, whether it's 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees, 3 degrees, which means accelerates the climate effect on cities. So that the crisis facing cities is actually greater than it's likely to be greater than it is in all of your projections. And for the reasons it's hard to mobilize people currently, in fact, it's still hard nationally. So it makes me frankly very worried. I have a beach house in Maine. In the past 5 years, we've had 200-year floods. The US government subsidizes flood insurance. So I suppose I'm fine, but that's not true
For now.
anymore. For now, right. So I guess that's by way of saying that I think at the same time as we are supporting and publicizing and cheering on the largest and most ambitious, we need to be thinking about the context within which all the others have to operate. And those opportunities aren't uniform across the globe. There are political moments that we have to pay attention to. Matt and I were talking before we came about, how does Gates take account of the political context in the countries they're working in? But do you tackle everything everywhere, or do you pick your targets and see where you can make a change? Because the political economy of these things are all local. The issues in Moldova are different than in Mozambique and different in Mongolia. And water rolls downhill everywhere, but the moments and the opportunities don't arise uniformly across the map. So I'm, by way of saying, I'm applauding everything you're doing, Kate.
But it's not enough.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Well, you've posed a couple of questions. We'll see if the hands go up right away, but I'm going to add one other, which is, and let me recap what I think it's one question with several parts, but I think Chaz was raising this issue of where are these opportunities as case studies, really, where the climate challenge can result in some kind of larger scale effort to tackle difficult underlying long-lasting governance challenges. And that's sort of a reverse co-benefit. There's the benefit of mitigation, which I think we'd all agree, health is one of the things that mayors increasingly care about, the health of their citizens from emissions, et cetera. But anyway, so I think one question is, I pose it to Kate in particular, but if people in your organization are keeping track of places where you're seeing movement across broader issues of decentralization and finance, locally spurred, probably at least by climate change, and whether that can be better publicized to sort of say, look, take the risk. We know this is existential. More mayors need to step up and say, it might not be wholesale reform, but it's reform that clearly goes beyond just financing these sort of individual projects. So that's one question. And then I would just add the question about data, which is we heard about the issue from Matt of we know that national governments have a lot of good data in their possession at the subnational level. I'd love to hear more about, maybe again, case examples where that's been very proactively shared, but more important, I think, is the question of, which I think Matt raised, which is the issue of how is that data used and interpreted, and what kind of technical assistance may be necessary for cities and states to better understand and organize and prioritize the data that they, may have either on their own or from federal authorities. How can they better use that data? So why don't we have a little conversation around that, and then we'll open it up for others.
Sure, just two small questions there to kick things
Yeah.
off. On the first question, which is really, to me, a question about governance and mainstreaming and institutionalizing, not just climate action, as you noted, I think we definitely approach it through the lens of what are the structures that cities need to have in place to achieve their climate goals, and from a place of mainstreaming and governance. And so I think that the byproduct of that is some more sophisticated fiscal management systems. So, one initiative that we're really excited about that we've been piloting for the past couple of years with 10 cities around the world is called climate budgeting, which is a way to approach your budget. It's a little different than carbon budgeting, which folks may have heard about, where like a city has a budget for how much carbon emissions can be associated with the things that they're doing and buying and everything in the city. This is a little bit different. And it's actually looking at your budget and saying, if we're serious about achieving our climate goals, whether that's in a climate action plan or elsewhere, have we aligned our budget to actually do that? And if not, what's the gap? How are we going to fill it? Is it with private finance? Is it with, national or state level funding? And that process has been, I think, really illustrative for the cities that have gone through it. So the pilot includes cities as diverse as, this is really something that Oslo has pioneered. But now we've got cities, London, Mumbai, New York City, Montreal, Rio, that are going through this process as well. And it is having I think a byproduct of, you can't do that process without looking at more broadly at how you budget, and how that reflects your priorities or not. And what are the gaps that as a local government you can't fill on your own. And so I think it's having that byproduct. So that's just maybe one example. And I'll also just maybe in reacting, Chaz, to your points too about sort of the political economy around who holds the money and how it flows and the challenges therein. I think we saw that play out here in the United States as well, where if you look across the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure law, almost all the money that was available to local governments was competitive grants that were completely oversubscribed. So the amount of money was never going to meet the need. But on the other hand, you saw states, because of their longstanding position in our federal system, getting lots of very flexible formula money that they didn't have to compete for. And I think that's an ongoing challenge that cities face and local governments face is they don't have the consistency and the flexibility of investment from the federal level that is happening at the state level, and whether or not they get access to that state funding varies quite a bit state to state. So I think you spoke about some global examples, but I think that's very relevant here in the US context as well. Malcolm, on your data question, I am not a data person, so I have lots of amazing data people that could speak to this in more detail. But this was definitely a gap that we encountered as we launched the CHAMP initiative, which is if you want to include local action in a nationally determined commitment, you actually have to be able to quantify what that local action adds up to. We're able to do that in a country like the United States because we do have lots of great local greenhouse gas emissions data. In other countries, that has not been the case. So in Brazil, we actually invested quite a bit in a local data project so that Brazil could incorporate local action into their national commitment in a credible way. And I think we learned a lot through that process. And it's something that we realize is a barrier to getting other national governments to really think seriously about what local action can contribute. But if there's any questions on how we did that or the methodology, I'll have to connect you to my colleagues.
Any response here before we open it up? Great. Floor is open. Yes, and maybe identify yourself and your affiliation.
Thibault from the French Embassy here in DC. I had two questions. Was more the Gates Foundation. Are you planning to try to compensate for the withdrawal of international climate finance from the federal level or not? And the other one is more regarding the local level. So for all of you, do you see a less strong difference between like a Republican climate policy and a Democrat climate policy at the local level for a city or a state, or the difference is as strong as here in DC in Congress, for instance?
Yeah, we'll take. Yeah, take
Oh,
one.
if
or
it
two
works.
others. Yeah,
Should we take more questions?
sure.
Hi, my name is Rami Jadvab. I'm a professor of economics here. Actually, one of the co-organizers of the event. 28% of carbon emissions in the world come from the US. So what's happening in US cities is very important. I like the fact that you try to expand the network to more cities in the global south, but actually urban policy in the US has a much bigger impact. So you showed us an example with the gondola in Sierra Leone. I think that's great for public transportation in the slums, but actually what's happening in cities like LA, Dallas, Houston, is much more important for the world in terms of like mitigation of carbon emissions and climate change impacts. The truth is that these are the bad boys of the world in terms of like urban policy. They're way behind European cities. They're behind East Asian cities like Singapore, Seoul. And I think of France, for example, where we had right-wing governments for like, a long period of time in the UK, but the mayors try to innovate and try to implement policies. But I don't know, the mayors in LA, they're more like managers than innovators. And maybe it comes to a question of structure and all that, but they have budgets. They can borrow money. I think there's a lack of ideas in US cities. And so since you represent the US for C40, I'd like to know more what you're doing for US cities. Oh, finally, we have a lot of students here. They're not going to find a federal government job with what's happening. And so if you can tell us more about local government jobs that, and in the sphere of like climate change, that would be very useful for the students in the room.
More?
Hi, sorry, hi. My name is Anka Mare. I'm a master's student enrolled in international development with a focus on human settlements. I'm very curious, Matt, one of the, I guess, like challenges that you mentioned is the motivation to act, especially from like a government, scale, because it's so hard to actually measure prevention. So it's often in like response to disasters where, finance investment will come. So I'm curious how, the Gates Foundation or even C40 Cities well, do you think this is because it's hard to measure prevention? And then how can one go about changing mindset or behavioral change? Because I think that's one of the biggest challenges, I think, in international development, because it's difficult to get to. So I'm just curious how your organizations, approach that.
Maybe I'll
Take the last.
yeah, maybe I'll
The other two.
take the first one on whether we'll pick up the slack. Unfortunately, no. I mean, so our budget, annual budget in terms of actual grants going out the door is probably around $7 billion US, and the scale is just tremendous. It's going to be very difficult to meet that. And most of the investments we do are in the health space. So with the US withdrawal from WHO seeming likely after the year elapses, we would become the biggest donor for WHO, which is kind of wild, not being a national government. And there's a lot of areas where it would be great if we could. We just don't have the resources. And also, I think it's maybe not appropriate for philanthropic capital to play that role, not only because it's not elected for some of these bodies, but also because philanthropic capital is kind of unique. It can be a lot more nimble and risk tolerant than donor governments. Yeah, I guess that's my long-winded answer. I know Bloomberg has agreed to pick up some of the slack around UNFCCC, for instance, which is great, but I don't think that can be a long-term solution, unfortunately, for a lot of these. And maybe if I have the mic, I can also answer the last question. Yeah, cool. Yeah, just in terms of the last question. Yeah, I think part of the incentive piece is adaptation and resilience in particular. So focusing on that instead of mitigation, because it's more my area. It's in a lot of ways, it's about risk, which is not something that gets a lot of people really motivated, except for in the direct aftermath of the actualization of the risk, like in LA. So a lot of what we're trying to do, and I think that the COP30 presidency, Brazil is trying to do as well, is reorient around what's the economic opportunity. So adaptation and resilience investments aren't just adaptation investments; they're investments in development. They have returns relative, whether or not the actual risk materializes. So there's this thing called the triple dividend of adaptation investments that WRI and other partners pioneered, and it indicates that. And there's some forthcoming research that we've supported that hopefully we publish before the summer that indicates that adaptation and resilience investments are really good investments overall. They have very high rates of return, regardless of whether the risk that adaptation was trying to address does materialize. The other aspect of this, I think, particularly on the national level, is debt sustainability is a perennial issue for a lot of developing countries. If you, and increasingly, credit rating agencies are taking account of climate risks when they're assessing the debt risk and debt sustainability of countries. If you're able to make the case that the investments that countries are making to build economic resilience to these shocks will strengthen the ability to take on debt, that's a really strong argument to make to government. So you have to find what the exact incentives are to change the behavior in places like ministries of finance, and those are some of the key ones, I would say.
All right. I think I'm going to answer. I can do 1.5. I think your question about the partisanship around climate at the local level is actually related to your point about where are the U.S. mayors. So maybe I'll take those a little bit in tandem. I think largely climate is less partisan at the local level. Actually, a lot of our mayors and the mayors we work with through, Climate Mayors, which is a network of 350 mayors, so cities of all sizes, Republican, Democrat, a lot of them are actually hold a nonpartisan office. So they might be affiliated with a party, but they're not elected as a Republican or a Democrat. So I do think, at the local level, it's much easier to get around the partisanship because there are issues of quality of life that every mayor has to be able to deal with are related to climate. If you're a mayor in Florida, you have to be talking about extreme weather and resilience, whether you're a Republican or Democrat, or whether you use the word climate when you do it. So I think we do see that. Unfortunately, at the state level, we've seen trends in the other direction where it's become more partisan, and there are really worrying trends around state preemption of local government action on climate or climate-related issues, and I think that's only likely to continue, under the Trump administration. in terms of, I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name. Remy, you have a rather dismal view of our US mayors. And I'm challenged with what to do with that. I think it is in part, we haven't done a very good job of telling the stories of what is happening at the local level in the US. I think in part because for the past 4 years, the climate movement was very excited about everything happening here in DC. And so there's been a lot of innovation happening that isn't getting, I would say, the attention that it deserves. Yet when we bring together our network of cities, there's a lot of learning from US cities that cities in Europe, Australia, and Asia are looking to do. I think in particular around on the adaptation side, around urban heat island mitigation and dealing with extreme heat. Some of our cities are world leaders in that, I would say. Phoenix, for example. Actually, the city of LA is doing a lot of really innovative work in that space. Another area where our sort of global cities look to the US for leadership is around building decarbonization. So one of the most challenging things that cities are facing on the mitigation side is how do you get fossil fuels out of existing buildings? And really, the only cities that have come up with robust policy solutions on that are in the US. They're under attack by the fossil gas industry. But you're right here in Washington, D.C., for example, was the first city in the world to put a mandatory limit on carbon emissions from existing buildings. And so I think there is a lot of leadership. It doesn't always get the attention it deserves, but there are also a lot of challenges. I think some of the cities that have been most innovative have figured out ways to fund climate action locally. So that includes Denver, which has an amazing sales tax scheme that's funding their climate and clean energy programs. Seattle, it's called the Amazon tax, but it's a large employer tax that funds their climate and environmental justice initiatives. Portland they have their big box store, so it's a fee on large retailers. So I think you're going to see a lot of innovation in that space where U.S. cities realize they can't count on federal investment to achieve their climate goals. So how are they going to do it locally? And maybe we just need to do a better job of telling their stories. And yes, for all of you who don't think you're going to get a job in the federal government, local governments would love to hire you. So let's talk.
Other questions?
I do have one question from our online audience. So from someone, Francisco, tuning in from Guadalajara, Mexico, asks, can you provide an example of an innovative local or state climate program in Latin America that was embraced by the local population and has persisted despite a change in administration at the national level?
I haven't followed the national level in a lot of our Latin American cities, but so maybe I'll just mention an area where I think they are absolutely leading globally and has certainly weathered some national transitions, which is around zero emission transport, especially buses. So our US cities look to our Latin American cities in envy at the pace at which they've been able to electrify their public bus systems. And I think this is, in part, it's not a climate solution. They approach it from these buses are cleaner from an air pollution standpoint, they're quieter, they're more comfortable to ride. And so they've built this sort of expectation in a lot of cities that, of course, we're going to transition all of our bus fleets to zero emission buses. That's proven to be quite durable, really, throughout the region. And I know a lot of our US cities would love to have that level of zero emission bus adoption.
Thanks. Andrew, I wanted to mention just a report that I co-authored last year with an organization called the Public Finance Initiative. And the report was supported and published actually by the Pew Charitable Trust, but it was on state infrastructure finance. And we looked at 15 select states meant to be representative in the US, looking under their hood at the budgets of the states and trying to compare apples to apples of how those different states' budgets reflected just their policy goals and everything else. Climate was actually just one of many components, but I wanted to ask actually, well, just to make one of the observations and takeaways was, just, I mean, it's not necessarily a surprise, but there's a massive discrepancy between stated goals that can be reflected in, say, a climate action plan, and then actually looking at the budgets of the states. And we would, as I said, would try to go under the hood and, you know, with muni bonds, look at the use of proceeds and all this sort of thing. And not many people are actually paying attention to this issue. And I mean, a lot of my past work has been more on, you know, working with IIEP and C40 and international organizations, helping governments develop climate action plans and such. So I'm just was wondering how there could be more savvy and sophistication of within treasuries and budget offices to actually, you know, that goes beyond, say, sometimes the policy goals of particular politicians, but actually there may be areas where we can improve this just through actually honing in on this issue more than maybe it's been in the past. Thanks.
You have an organizational affiliation, or?
Yeah, I'm consulting with the Public Finance Initiative, which is the NGO that published the report. And it's and I teach at Harvard Graduate School of Design and Public Finance.
Thank you.
Yeah, Mike Kishishian. I used to work at USAID, and the role of local governments and at the subnational level for climate change is, of course, really important. But I also see how they might become less important as they're becoming less important. The role of the national government might become less important for local climate change in the U.S. as well as other countries where this could be a trend we're seeing globally. So I'm thinking, therefore, can we also be looking at local government associations that could be providing that kind of support at the subnational level, especially in countries where local governments actually have a lot of power, like the Philippines or Nepal, US Federation, where these governments actually have capacity and they have finance. I'm sorry, not capacity. They have authority and they have finance, but they lack capacity. And therefore, they have to send money back to Treasury every year because they just can't budget it, whether it's for climate change or health or education. And in some countries where we have worked with USAID, we've helped local government associations provide that kind of expertise to local governments to write the proposals for grants, to do the assessments for flood zones and all that. Because you can't expect every local government to have the in-house expertise to be able to do that sort of thing. So we did a lot of that kind of work in Poland early on, actually. We had local private consultants through the local government association helping governments with less capacity. So my question is there a role for local government associations in working with governments, climate change?
Sure. I mean, we certainly think so. I mean, that's it's work that actually we try to do in a number of our cities in the Global South with the support of national development finance agencies. So recognizing the capacity problem, if you want to invest in formalizing the waste sector in a city in Africa, they probably don't have any staff that know how to do that. And so our sort of implementation model is very much, you can't just invest in the project and the infrastructure, you have to invest in the capacity too. And so sometimes that'll look like we're actually hiring staff and embedding them in city governments with, you know, funding that we're receiving from UK or Danish, German, a little bit of USAID funding as well. So, and, you know, I think that expands beyond just cities in our network. So we're involved in a lot of kind of multiple partnerships with other local government associations to do that, but there's certainly room for more. And I'll also note the mayor of Quezon City from the Philippines is one of our vice chairs, and she's amazing. Yeah.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Stacy Dean from GW's Global Food Institute. I'm just curious if you could talk a little bit more about coming at this from I mean, you gave the example of the buses, which was, it's just a better bus system. It has the benefit of being climate positive. I think about it from food and agriculture. So the food system is, suggested or reported to be about 30%, a third of carbon emission and causing climate change. So, and a lot of investments that I've seen in that space are about improving farmers' livelihoods, encouraging young and new farmers into the space, getting governors and local leaders to be thinking about their food systems to be more resilient after the pandemic. So that's just ideas that are coming to my mind on actions that local governments have taken that are climate positive, but were not sold in that angle. So curious if you have other examples of where maybe these ideas were advanced, not being climate forward messaging, but instead something completely different and hopefully was successful. But ag is definitely a space where there's been billions of investment in the US. Farmers make more money, companies like it. There's a lot more work to do for sure, but like a lot of positive momentum that was local government driven as well.
No, we don't do a ton of work in the agriculture space, so I don't know, Matt, if that's something you want to take or.
Yeah, I can answer that just briefly, and I'm knowing I'm not an agronomist, but there's a lot of focus that we're doing now on can you capture some of the mitigation co-benefits of locally led adaptation projects within agriculture. So that is very intentionally going for the mitigation, but not as the primary objective. For us, it's the productivity and the resilience in smallholder farmers in Africa, but there are mitigation benefits. And if we're able to quantify and capture those, and local government has an important role in helping develop those systems for tracking the mitigation reductions. So also the side benefit of that is if there's a shift eventually to a compliance-based carbon price at some point in response to CBAM or something like that, that system will already exist, and local government will have a really important role of helping to enforce or verify some of that collection. So I'm not sure if that answers your question at all.
Well, I think the example that Chaz mentioned is congestion pricing. We have a number of cities around the world, from London to Stockholm to Singapore, that have put in place some form of pricing system around traffic. I don't know if any of them did that with climate as the primary driver. It was about reducing congestion, dealing with local air pollution issues, creating a revenue stream to invest in transit, which is, I mean, that's why New York is doing it, because the MTA is broke. So I think I think there's lots of examples like that. There's probably some policy and program design to optimize those solutions from a climate perspective, but very often we see, the driver is not primarily, climate mitigation or adaptation, and we're kind of fine with that if it works.
I don't want to miss the gentleman in the back's question. So if there's anybody who wants to respond to examples of where people are looking more scrupulously under the hood in
Well,
this
I mean,
context.
that's what our cities are doing that are piloting climate budgeting, is exactly the process that you mentioned. So maybe some of those states that you looked at need to use the framework we've developed. But I think there's both a technical capacity challenge to do that work and to really think about, the greenhouse gas implications of every part of your budget. But there's also a political commitment needed, because it's sort of radical transparency, right? To admit, yeah, we've set these lofty goals, but we actually have no intention, at least in our current budget, of meeting them. So I think that is a tension. I mean, that's sort of the point, but that's also why it's not happening, I think, already. I'm sure you discovered that in your research as well.
We have time, I think, for two more questions, maybe.
Hi, everyone. Helen Santiago Fink. I'm a climate urbanist and up to very recently a program manager for the US ASEAN Smart Cities Partnership embedded at the State Department. We've been paused, but my portfolio, Smart Sustainable Cities in Southeast Asia, everybody has asked me in the past is, why are you not doing that in the US? And so I want to get back to Remy's point in terms of, given the current environment here, I think it behooves us really to look at bringing climate action to the US. And obviously, as we're talking here, bringing it down to the subnational level. And mobilizing all kinds of actors and calling it climate or not climate actions that actually ultimately address resiliency, address adaptation, address public health, address quality of life, and don't put a label on it if it's, too politically sensitive. I have, and I am trying now, and to try to salvage a lot of the work that I've done in Makassar, in Vientiane, many countries in Southeast Asia, and try to pivot it to bring it to here, because I think the US can really benefit from it. So focusing on climate action, nature-based solutions, resource circularity, what is a circular economy, what can we do with smart mobility, agri-tech. I have my partners here from NREL. We did integrated urban systems. So how can we look at integrated urban systems to actually do revenue generation? So we need to be creative now in this current trying environment. And so my question to you guys and to the panel here, we know that Bloomberg has offered to take up a little bit of the slack. I don't know exactly what that means, but how they're going to be directing it, as they did during the first Trump administration. I know the European Commission is actually, like they did back in 2016, they've got these programs, which I worked on back in 2016, the International Urban Cooperation, but bringing actually DG funding to OECD states to advance climate action. And they've done that in North America, in Canada, in the US. And there's another reiteration, it's under EU dialogues, and it's coming from DG Klima and the DG Partnerships, DG, they've changed the name recently. So my question again, what is Gates, what's C40, what's the Urban Institute, what are other actors that are well-positioned and working with US cities? How can we bring international examples? I'm happy to share the resources from my international work to bring them to US cities. And how can the US cities that have done good work, as you rightly say, how can they double down and share that work with other US cities and subnational actors, really to move forward and ensure that we not regress even more so from a US perspective and a carbon footprint? Thank you.
Thank you. One more question?
Left off. So we've talked about solution sets and enablers to solution sets, or in some cases barriers, having to do with governance, having to do with finance. As a practitioner of regenerative and green infrastructure solutions and agricultural solutions, I find that frequently there are opportunities, as Helen was saying, if you abandon the labels, to pilot and commercialize and scale solution sets that conventionally might not fall into the mitigation category, but will be much simpler to enlist private sector interest and investment, or even cooperation in cases we have public-private partnerships, than if you go into it purely from the climate standpoint. That's the first sort of follow-on. The second follow-on is we really haven't talked much about the era that we're in now with the onset of artificial intelligence and large language models, and what the impact of that is on planning. And I think urban planning, agricultural planning, and planning of general human systems of infrastructure and organization has been an outlier when it's compared to just about every other field, in that it's not looked at systemically in the design process. Take medicine, take microchip technology, take production of a car. There is a long-standing history of development of a systematic process to give you the best efficiency, to give you the best productivity, and that's actually been lacking in how we organize human systems. So this is some of the work we were doing together with NREL, the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, was turning the model on its head and seeing where there are still latent opportunities in directing investment towards new technologies and new systemic approaches towards human development. Now, we were looking primarily at emerging markets because that's where you have a lot of the opportunity for unbuilt growth still. So that's my rather long follow-on that was supposed to be short. And, oh, yeah, I didn't introduce myself either. My name is Jan David Mueller-Volmer, and I am with Regenerative Impact Ventures. And we were a contractor supporting the National Renewable Energy Laboratory in this work in the ASEAN region.
Thank you. So,
I mean, I think
Try to-
I heard at least one question in there, which was how do we bring more of these international examples to US cities? And I would say there's a whole ecosystem of networks of cities and local governments to tap into. So C40, obviously, we're just the big cities. We have 14 cities in the US, but we work very closely with Climate Mayors, which is a network of 350 mayors, cities of all sizes. The Urban Sustainability Directors Network is an amazing network of the practitioners in cities and counties in the US and Canada. And then there's a whole host of other, networks, whether they're at the state or the local level. So these relationships and this infrastructure exists. And it's probably far more robust than I would say it was in 2017, the last time we were in a similar situation. So I think take advantage of those existing networks. I think there's, and sometimes in moments of crisis, a desire to spin up a whole bunch of new stuff. And we see that from the philanthropic community at times. And I think this is really a moment where let's take advantage of the resources and the capacity and the connections we already have and make sure those best examples are getting shared. And that we're resourcing those networks to provide the support that our US local governments need right now.
all right, I think we have to wrap up, unfortunately, but it's been a great conversation. I want to thank Kate and Matt and Chaz, but also you, the audience, for some really thoughtful comments and questions. And I think we've actually been able to cover quite a bit of ground on an enormous topic. It's always hard with this topic to boil it down to something less than a full day or 2 days or 3 days. So in the space of an hour and a half, I think we surfaced a lot of issues. So I've taken notes. I think our panelists have too. And please look for other opportunities to attend these events in the speakers series. And thank you for coming.